Dwight Eisenhower. One of the most infamous acts of U.S. intervention in Africa under President Dwight Eisenhower was the CIA-backed assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. Lumumba, a strong anti-colonialist, came to power in 1960 when Congo gained independence from Belgium. However, his vision of a truly independent Congo, free from Western economic exploitation, put him at odds with both the US and Belgium. When Belgium refused to relinquish control over Katanga, a mineral-rich province crucial to Western economic interests, Lumumba sought help from the Soviet Union to stabilize his government. This alarmed the Eisenhower administration, which was deeply entrenched in Cold War ideology and feared the spread of communism in Africa. Eisenhower personally authorized the CIA to eliminate Lumumba, considering him a threat to U.S. interests. The CIA, under Allen Dulles, funneled money and resources to Congolese military leader Joseph Mobutu, later Mobutu Sese Seko, who was already working to undermine Lumumba's government. Eventually, with US and Belgian support, Lumumba was arrested, tortured, and handed over to his enemies in Katanga, where he was executed on January 17, 1961. His body was later dissolved in acid to prevent it from becoming a symbol of resistance. This assassination plunged the DRC into decades of dictatorship under Mobutu, who ruled with Western backing, brutally suppressing opposition while allowing U.S. corporations to exploit Congo's vast copper, cobalt, and diamond resources. The U.S. not only removed a nationalist leader, but also helped install a corrupt dictator who kept Congo in a cycle of poverty and resource extraction for Western benefit. Beyond the Congo, Eisenhower's policies emboldened European colonial powers, particularly France, Belgium, and Britain, to resist African independence movements. His administration provided financial and military assistance to France's brutal war in Algeria, 1954 to 1962, against independence fighters, ensuring continued suffering for millions of Africans. Eisenhower's anti-communist doctrine meant that any African leader advocating self-determination and control over national resources was labeled a Soviet sympathizer, justifying coups, assassinations, and economic sabotage. His presidency laid the foundation for decades of Western intervention that stunted Africa's development. Richard Nixon. Under President Richard Nixon, U.S. policy toward Africa was largely shaped by Cold War geopolitics, with a pro-Western stability at all costs approach that directly harmed African nations fighting for true independence. One of Nixon's most damaging legacies in Africa was his strong support for the apartheid regime in South Africa. Unlike previous administrations that at least considered condemning apartheid, Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger doubled down on support for the racist white minority government, ensuring that the U.S. continued to provide diplomatic and economic backing despite growing international outrage. South Africa was a key U.S. ally due to its vast gold, diamond, and uranium reserves, which were crucial for U.S. industries and nuclear programs. By refusing to impose sanctions or cut ties, Nixon ensured that the systemic oppression, forced removals, and violence against Black South Africans under apartheid continued unchallenged. Beyond South Africa, Nixon actively propped up Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a dictator who had seized power in a CIA-backed coup following Lumumba's assassination. Mobutu was a key U.S. ally in the region and received massive financial aid and military support despite ruling with an iron fist. Under Nixon, the U.S. funneled millions of dollars to Mobutu, who used it to enrich himself and suppress political opposition, while ordinary Congolese citizens lived in extreme poverty. The Nixon administration also provided support for Portugal's brutal colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, where African independence movements were crushed with U.S.-backed weapons and logistical support. Perhaps Nixon's most destructive policy in Africa was his administration's intervention in Angola. When Angola was on the verge of gaining independence from Portugal in 1975, Nixon's administration began secretly funding and arming Jonas Savimbi's UNITA rebels, a move that plunged Angola into a 27-year civil war that killed hundreds of thousands and left the country in ruins. This was done purely to counter Soviet influence, with no regard for the suffering it would cause to Angolans. The Nixon era solidified the U.S. habit of choosing dictators over democracy in Africa, supporting oppressive regimes that ensured Western economic dominance while crushing nationalist movements that sought real freedom. Ronald Reagan. President Ronald Reagan was one of the most openly pro-apartheid U.S. leaders, and his policies directly prolonged suffering in South Africa, Angola, and several other African nations. At a time when most of the world was condemning apartheid, Reagan vetoed sanctions against South Africa, defended its white minority government, and even referred to Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, ANC, as terrorists. The Reagan administration's official policy towards South Africa was called constructive engagement, a euphemism for continued support of the apartheid regime under the excuse of maintaining stability and countering Soviet influence. Instead of pressuring South Africa to end apartheid, Reagan's administration strengthened economic and military ties with the regime, allowing U.S. companies to continue profiting from South African gold, diamonds, and uranium, while black South Africans endured brutal state violence, forced removals, and political repression. Reagan's policies also fueled one of the deadliest conflicts in modern African history, the Angolan Civil War. After Angola gained independence from Portugal in 1975, its government was led by the MPLA, People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, which had Soviet and Cuban backing. In response, Reagan poured millions of dollars into arming and training UNITA, a rebel group led by Jonas Savimbi, a warlord who committed mass atrocities, including massacring civilians and using child soldiers. The CIA funneled money and weapons to UNITA, escalating a war that lasted until 2002 and left over 500,000 Angolans dead while displacing millions. The Reagan-backed UNITA forces targeted infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, ensuring that Angola remained in a state of chaos and underdevelopment for decades. In Mozambique, Reagan continued similar tactics, supporting the brutal Renamo insurgents, who terrorized civilians with tactics such as beheadings, rape, and mass killing. Renamo was used as a tool to weaken the socialist government of Mozambique, which was aligned with the Soviet Union. This US-backed conflict led to the deaths of over 1 million people. Additionally, Reagan's administration strengthened the US military presence in Africa, laying the groundwork for AFRICOM, the US military's African Command, which has since been used to justify military interventions that serve US strategic interests. His reckless funding of warlords, refusal to sanction apartheid, and support for right-wing dictators devastated multiple African countries, leaving long-lasting scars that continue to impact the continent today. Bill Clinton. Despite his reputation as a more humanitarian president, Bill Clinton's actions and inaction caused immense suffering in Africa, most notably through his failure to prevent the Rwandan genocide and his bombing of Sudan's largest pharmaceutical plant. The most damning indictment of Clinton's presidency was his administration's complete refusal to intervene during the 1994 Rwandan genocide, where 800,000 to 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered in just 100 days. The US government had intelligence on the escalating violence well before the mass killings began, yet Clinton's administration blocked all efforts to send international peacekeeping forces. In fact, Clinton ordered the United Nations to withdraw its troops rather than increase their presence, ensuring that genocidal militias, the Interahamwe, had free rein to commit mass killings. The administration also actively avoided using the word genocide for months, knowing that doing so would legally obligate the US to intervene under international law. It wasn't just inaction. Clinton's administration actively pressured the UN Security Council to reduce its forces in Rwanda, even as reports of massacres emerged. While thousands of Tutsis were being hacked to death with machetes, the US sat on the sidelines, later justifying its inaction as a fear of repeating the 1993 US military failure in Somalia. However, behind this excuse was a deeper strategic calculation. Rwanda had no valuable resources that the US could exploit, so its government saw no reason to intervene. Clinton later admitted his failure, but by that time, nearly 1 million people had died. Beyond Rwanda, Clinton caused devastation in Sudan in 1998. Following al-Qaeda's attacks on US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, Clinton ordered a missile strike on a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, Sudan, claiming it was producing chemical weapons for terrorists. This turned out to be false intelligence. The factory was actually Sudan's largest producer of life-saving medicines, including antibiotics and vaccines. The destruction of the factory led to severe medical shortages, increasing preventable deaths from malaria, tuberculosis, and other treatable diseases. Humanitarian organizations estimated that tens of thousands of Sudanese people died as a result of this reckless bombing. Clinton never issued an apology or compensation, leaving Sudan to deal with the aftermath of the attack. Furthermore, Clinton's administration, much like his predecessors, continued to support dictators and corrupt leaders in Africa as long as they served US interests. He continued the IMF and World Bank's economic policies, which forced African nations into crushing debt while prioritizing Western corporate profits. These structural adjustment programs forced African governments to cut social services like healthcare and education, worsening poverty and making them more dependent on Western aid. Clinton's failure in Rwanda, his destruction of Sudan's healthcare infrastructure, and his continued economic stranglehold on African economies cemented the U.S.'s exploitative role in Africa during the 1990s, showing that even so-called humanitarian presidents prioritized American interests over African lives. George Bush. While George Bush is often credited for launching HIV/AIDS relief efforts in Africa through PEPFAR, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, his overall impact on the continent was deeply harmful, particularly through his expansion of U.S. military operations and direct interventions in Somalia. Bush's presidency marked the beginning of a new era of militarization in Africa, where counterterrorism was used as a cover for advancing U.S. geopolitical and economic interests. His most damaging policy was the creation of AFRICOM, United States Africa Command, in 2007, a military program that placed American forces in strategic African nations under the pretext of counterterrorism. This has led to long-term instability, drone warfare, and the erosion of national sovereignty in African nations. One of the most destructive direct actions under Bush was his administration's 2006 invasion of Somalia, where the U.S. supported Ethiopian military forces to overthrow the Islamic Courts Union (ICU), an Islamist political movement that had been bringing relative stability to Somalia after years of civil war. The U.S. falsely labeled the ICU as a terrorist organization, arguing that it was linked to al-Qaeda, despite evidence to the contrary. With Bush's backing, Ethiopian troops invaded Somalia in late 2006, leading to mass displacement and civilian deaths. The invasion backfired spectacularly, creating the conditions for the rise of al-Shabaab, the extremist militant group that continues to terrorize Somalia and neighboring countries to this day. By destabilizing Somalia with military aggression, Bush's administration turned the country into a permanent war zone, worsening famine and leading to tens of thousands of deaths. Additionally, Bush's counterterrorism operations in the Sahel region, West Africa, increased military tensions and led to human rights abuses by U.S.-trained African forces. Under the guise of fighting terrorism, Bush provided weapons and military training to authoritarian governments in Chad, Niger, and Mali, many of which used this support to crack down on political opposition rather than actual terrorist threats. His administration's policies exacerbated conflicts and led to widespread civilian casualties, making African countries more dependent on American military aid instead of fostering genuine security or development. Furthermore, Bush's economic policies continued the IMF and World Bank's neoliberal agenda, forcing African nations to accept crippling loans in exchange for opening their markets to Western corporations. These structural adjustment programs, SAPs, resulted in cuts to public health services, education, and local industries, ensuring that Africa remained an exporter of raw materials for U.S. and European profits rather than developing its own independent economies. While Bush marketed himself as a friend of Africa through PEPFAR, his overall policies ensured continued U.S. dominance over African resources, worsened military conflicts, and made African governments more reliant on Washington's decisions. Barack Obama. Despite being the first U.S. president of African descent, Barack Obama's policies were some of the most destructive toward Africa, particularly through his administration's role in the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya, which led to the collapse of the Libyan state, the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, and the emergence of slave markets and terrorist strongholds in North Africa. In March 2011, under the pretense of protecting civilians from government crackdowns, Obama authorized U.S. and NATO airstrikes against Libya, helping to overthrow Gaddafi's government. However, this intervention had nothing to do with human rights. Libya, under Gaddafi, was one of the most economically prosperous African nations, with free healthcare, education, and the highest Human Development Index, HDI, on the continent. Gaddafi was also working to establish a pan-African currency backed by gold, which would have weakened Western economic dominance in Africa. This made him a target for regime change. Once Gaddafi was brutally executed by Western-backed rebel forces, Libya descended into complete chaos, becoming a failed state overrun by rival militias and terrorist groups. The Libyan slave trade re-emerged, with African migrants being captured and sold in open-air slave markets, a direct consequence of the power vacuum left by Obama's intervention. The fall of Libya also destabilized the entire Sahel region, as weapons from Gaddafi's military stockpiles were looted and spread across West Africa, fueling conflicts in Mali, Niger, Chad, and Burkina Faso. The same extremists that the US claimed to be fighting benefited from the destruction of Libya, showing the hypocrisy of Obama's military policy in Africa. Beyond Libya, Obama massively increased drone warfare across Africa, especially in Somalia, Yemen, and Libya. His administration expanded AFRICOM's operations, turning it into a permanent fixture of US military intervention in Africa. Drone strikes, carried out under the pretense of targeting terrorists, resulted in thousands of civilian deaths, with many victims being innocent farmers, villagers, and even children. Obama's drone war in Somalia, in particular, strengthened al-Shabaab, much like Bush's policies had, by radicalizing survivors of drone attacks and increasing anti-American sentiment. In addition to military interventions, Obama's administration continued economic exploitation through the IMF and World Bank, pushing African nations further into debt while US corporations continued extracting Africa's wealth. While he was widely celebrated as a historic figure, his actual policies in Africa perpetuated violence, political instability, and economic subjugation. Many Africans hoped for a US president who would reverse the long history of Western exploitation, but instead, Obama's tenure saw Africa further entangled in Washington's global power games. Donald Trump. President Donald Trump's policies toward Africa were marked by escalating military aggression, mass civilian casualties from drone strikes, and open disdain for African nations. Unlike previous US presidents, who at least tried to disguise their interventions as humanitarian efforts, Trump was overtly hostile toward Africa, referring to African nations as shithole countries. In a 2018 meeting, beyond the rhetoric, his actions were even more damaging. Trump massively expanded drone warfare in Somalia, withdrew critical humanitarian aid, and strengthened AFRICOM's unchecked military operations across the continent. One of Trump's most destructive decisions was his dramatic increase in drone strikes across Africa, especially in Somalia. Under his administration, the Pentagon was given looser rules of engagement, meaning that US forces no longer had to prove an imminent threat before launching airstrikes. This change skyrocketed civilian casualties, with the US carrying out over 200 drone strikes in Somalia, more than under Bush and Obama combined. Reports from human rights organizations like Amnesty International confirmed that these strikes frequently killed innocent civilians, including women and children, labeling them as terrorists, with little evidence. Trump's aggressive bombing campaign strengthened al-Shabaab, much like Bush and Obama's interventions before him, by radicalizing survivors and fueling anti-American sentiment. Beyond military operations, Trump slashed humanitarian aid to African nations, worsening economic and food crises. His administration cut funding to programs that supported education, healthcare, and poverty reduction, leaving millions of Africans more vulnerable to disease and famine. In 2020, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, Trump cut funding to the World Health Organization, which was a crucial partner in Africa's pandemic response. This decision disproportionately harmed African nations, as many rely on WHO's support for vaccine distribution, medical supplies, and disease control programs. Trump also showed strong support for corrupt African dictators, particularly Paul Biya of Cameroon, whose government was carrying out a brutal crackdown against English-speaking Cameroonians. Despite evidence of mass killings, disappearances, and torture by Biya's regime, Trump continued providing military assistance to Cameroon, effectively aiding human rights abuses. His policies not only worsened conflicts in Africa, but also undermined efforts to promote democracy and human rights. Perhaps one of Trump's most reckless actions was his last-minute withdrawal of US troops from Somalia in 2021. While reducing foreign military presence might seem positive, Trump's chaotic, unplanned withdrawal left Somalia's fragile government exposed to al-Shabaab, which quickly exploited the power vacuum. His approach to Africa was marked by militarism, racism, and neglect, worsening instability while showing no concern for African lives. Joe Biden. President Joe Biden campaigned on reversing Trump's damaging policies, but in Africa, his administration has largely continued the same militarized approach, showing that US foreign policy remains unchanged no matter who is in office. Biden reinstated US troop presence in Somalia, escalated drone strikes, and further expanded AFRICOM's footprint across the continent. One of Biden's most harmful policies has been his continuation of airstrikes in Somalia, killing both al-Shabaab militants and civilians. Despite his administration claiming to be more careful with drone strikes, reports from human rights groups show that innocent Somalis are still dying in US attacks. These strikes have done nothing to eliminate al-Shabaab, just as previous interventions failed. Instead, fueling resentment against the US, and destabilizing Somalia further. Biden has also expanded AFRICOM's operations, increasing U.S. military involvement in West Africa and the Sahel region. Under the guise of fighting terrorism, the U.S. has been providing weapons, military training, and intelligence support to governments in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. But many of these governments have since been overthrown by military coups, partly as a backlash against foreign interference. Biden's approach has led to an increase in anti-Western sentiment across Africa, with many countries now rejecting U.S. influence and looking toward alternative partners like China and Russia. Economically, Biden has continued the same exploitative trade and debt policies that keep Africa dependent on the West. The U.S. remains a major force behind IMF and World Bank loans, which impose crippling debt and harsh austerity measures on African economies, preventing them from developing independently. African leaders have increasingly spoken out against this economic model, yet Biden's administration has done nothing to change it, instead pushing for policies that keep Africa as a resource supplier rather than an economic equal. Biden has also maintained U.S. support for authoritarian leaders like Paul Kagame in Rwanda and Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, despite their long histories of human rights abuses, election rigging, and political repression. This hypocrisy, claiming to support democracy while propping up dictators, has further damaged the U.S.'s credibility in Africa. While Biden has re-engaged diplomatically with Africa, his administration's actual policies remain deeply militaristic and exploitative, showing that U.S. foreign policy toward Africa has barely changed from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. I know you were expecting more video like this, so hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps me bringing you more content.